At 10:03 a.m. on September 5th, 1944, the distant rumble of artillery fire echoed across the English countryside. The Battle of Normandy had shifted into its second phase, and as the Allies tightened their grip on occupied Europe, prisoners began to flood the front lines. In a quiet corner of northern France, behind the newly erected barbed wire fences, 200 German soldiers stood in the early autumn mist, eyes wide, shoulders stiff. They expected violence, brutality, the usual treatment reserved for the defeated. But as the last truck rolled to a halt, British soldiers, faces tired from their own battles, walked forward with trays of warm tea and bread. In the chaos of war, it was an unexpected gesture, small but monumental in its humanity. And there, among the faces, one German mechanic stood, confused, wondering if this was the calm before the storm, or the first signs of an unspoken, fragile truce. The morning of September 5th, 1944 arrived cold across the Normandy hedgerows. Dietrich Braun, a Wehrmacht mechanic from Hamburg's 21st Panzer Division, marched in a column of 200 men toward the British enclosure near Tilly-sur-Seulles. The air carried the acrid smell of cordite and burnt diesel from the previous day's engagement. His boots, worn through at the heels, scraped against gravel roads, still cratered from Allied bombing runs. Around him, men who had maintained Panzerwaffes and Tiger tanks now walked without weapons, without purpose. Their division had lost 60% of its armor in the Falaise pocket. Dietrich's hands, scarred from years of engine work, hung at his sides. He had repaired transmission systems under fire, kept vehicles running on salvaged parts and improvised solutions. Now those same hands were empty. The column slowed as barbed wire appeared through morning fog. British sentries stood at the perimeter, rifles slung casually over shoulders. Dietrich expected shouted orders, harsh treatment, the documented brutality he had heard about in Wehrmacht briefings. Instead, he heard something else entirely, the sound of water boiling in metal kettles, the clink of tin cups being arranged on wooden crates. A corporal from the Royal Army Service Corps stepped forward, steam rising from the tray he carried. "Right then," the corporal said in an accent Dietrich didn't fully understand. "Let's get you lots sorted with some tea." The words meant nothing to most of the prisoners, but the gesture, warm liquid in cups, bread wrapped in cloth, needed no translation. Dietrich stared at the outstretched cup, his mind struggling to reconcile this moment with everything he had been told about the enemy. British field headquarters operated from a commandeered farmhouse 3 kilometers behind the front lines on September 5th, 1944. Corporal Jack Lawrence of the Royal Army Service Corps had been awake since 04:30 hours, supervising the distribution of rations to forward positions. The kettle on the field stove hissed as water reached boiling point. Around him, men from the 50th Infantry Division prepared meals with practiced efficiency. They had landed on Gold Beach on June 6th and fought through Bocage country for 3 months. Their faces showed the accumulated fatigue of 90 days in combat. Lawrence lifted the kettle and poured hot water into a metal basin containing tea leaves. The brew was strong, Army-issue Indian tea that came in bulk, tins marked with War Department stamps. "They're just men," Lawrence said to Private Wilson, who stood nearby arranging bread rations. "Same as us, really. Just wore different uniforms." Wilson, 19 years old, from a Manchester textile mill, nodded without speaking. He had seen his first combat at Caen in July. The observation wasn't profound, but it carried weight in that particular moment. British military doctrine regarding prisoners of war had been established through multiple Geneva Convention protocols. The War Office Directive, WO 44-238, specified minimum standards for POW treatment, but this wasn't about directives. This was about men who had spent 3 months watching friends die, now choosing to extend basic human courtesy to defeated enemies. The decision wasn't unanimous. Some soldiers questioned the allocation of resources to prisoners when forward units still needed supplies, but Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery, commanding the sector, had made the policy clear in his morning briefing. We feed them, we treat them properly. That's the standard we maintain. The tea steamed in the morning air. Lawrence carried the first tray toward the wire enclosure. Behind him, Wilson followed with bread and tinned meat. The German prisoners stood in loose formation, uncertain and watchful. At 09:50 a.m. on September 5th, 1944, Dietrich Braun reached out and accepted the cup. The metal was warm against his palms. He had not held anything warm in 4 days, not since his unit's last functioning field kitchen had been destroyed by Allied fighter bombers near Wehr. The tea was too hot to drink immediately. He held it, letting heat seep into his fingers. Around him, other prisoners made similar calculations. Some accepted the cups cautiously, others refused initially, suspecting contamination or some form of psychological manipulation. A corporal from the 116th Panzer Division took a careful sip, then nodded to the men beside him. "Es ist nur tea," he said quietly. "Just tea, nothing more." The moment stretched across the enclosure. 200 men, defeated and displaced, stood holding British Army-issue cups in a field in northern France. The absurdity of it wasn't lost on Dietrich. 3 days earlier, he had been repairing a Panzer IV under shell fire. Now he stood drinking tea provided by the same army that had been trying to kill him. The warmth spread through his chest. He closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself this small comfort. When he opened them again, he saw British soldiers moving among the prisoners, distributing more cups, more bread. Their movements were routine, almost bureaucratic. This wasn't mercy in any dramatic sense. This was simply the application of a standard they had decided to maintain. Dietrich had heard stories about Soviet treatment of German prisoners. He had heard about Wehrmacht treatment of Soviet prisoners. The Eastern Front operated under different rules, where survival itself became a rare commodity. Here, in this muddy field in Normandy, a different standard applied. He didn't understand why. He didn't trust it completely. But he drank the tea, and for the first time since his capture, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that he might survive this war. That perhaps not all enemies were the same. By 10:30 a.m. on September 5th, 1944, the initial tension had begun to ease. Dietrich found himself sitting near one of the British campfires, still holding his empty cup. The fire burned in a metal drum, casting irregular shadows across the ground. Smoke drifted sideways in the morning breeze. Around him, German prisoners sat in small groups, speaking quietly among themselves. Some had fallen asleep where they sat, exhausted beyond the capacity for continued vigilance. A British engineer named Thomas approached with another piece of bread. He wore corporal's stripes and had oil stains on his uniform that Dietrich recognized immediately, the particular pattern left by working on vehicle transmissions. "You're a mechanic," Thomas said, not quite a question. His accent was thick, working-class London. Dietrich nodded. "Wehrmacht motorpool, 21st Panzer." Thomas sat down on an ammunition crate. "We've been running our Shermans 20 hours a day. Transmission failures every third vehicle." He spoke casually, as if they were colleagues discussing shop problems rather than enemies divided by wire and war. Dietrich found himself responding. "The M4 has weak final drive assemblies. The bogey system wears faster under sustained operation." Thomas grinned. "Tell me about it. We've been cannibalizing parts from knocked-out tanks just to keep the platoon mobile." For the next 20 minutes, they talked about mechanical problems, gear ratios, oil viscosity in different weather conditions, the superior engineering of German transmissions versus the superior production capacity of American manufacturing. It was a conversation that could have happened in any workshop, any garage, anywhere in the world. The war receded temporarily, replaced by the universal language of men who understood machines. But the war was still there. Artillery rumbled in the distance. A British officer walked past, checking on the prisoners. The wire fence stood as a permanent reminder of their respective positions. Dietrich knew this moment was temporary. Still, in that conversation about transmission assemblies and oil filters, something shifted. The enemy had become human, not friend perhaps, but human. British command operated from a map room in the farmhouse where Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Montgomery reviewed position reports at 11 a.m. on September 5, 1944. The map showed German positions retreating eastward toward the Seine. Red pins marked confirmed enemy units. Blue pins marked Allied advances. The strategic situation was clear. The Germans were beaten in Normandy, but not yet destroyed. Intelligence estimates suggested Wehrmacht forces would attempt to establish defensive lines along the Seine River. Allied planners expected fierce resistance. Meanwhile, 200 German prisoners sat in a field 3 kilometers away, drinking British tea. Montgomery stared at the map, considering the mathematics of war. 200 prisoners required food, water, guards, and medical attention. Each prisoner consumed resources that might otherwise support forward operations. Sergeant Watson, a career soldier from Yorkshire who had served in North Africa, stood beside the map table. "The men are asking questions, sir. Why we're feeding them when we've got shortages in the forward positions." Montgomery didn't look up from the map. "Because that's the standard we maintain, Sergeant. We're not barbarians, regardless of what the Germans did in Russia." Watson nodded. He had been at Dunkirk in 1940, had seen the evacuation from the beaches, he had fought through the desert campaigns, had been present when the 50th Division captured Tobruk. He understood that war had rules, even when those rules seemed arbitrary. "The lads understand, sir. Just wanted confirmation." Montgomery finally looked up. "Tell them this. Every German we feed properly is one less man who fights to the death next time. Word spreads. Prisoners talk. If Wehrmacht soldiers know they'll be treated decently, they're more likely to surrender when their position becomes untenable." It was pragmatic reasoning dressed in humanitarian language. The Geneva Convention required proper treatment of prisoners. But beyond legal obligation, there was strategic calculation. An enemy who expected decent treatment was an enemy more willing to quit fighting. The mathematics of war included psychological factors that didn't appear on maps or in casualty reports. Montgomery returned his attention to the map. The war continued, regardless of philosophical considerations about prisoner treatment. At 11:45 a.m. on September 5th, 1944, Dietrich sat with 3 other mechanics from his division. They shared a second ration of bread and discussed their situation in low voices. Otto Schneider, who had maintained the division's Tiger tanks, spoke first. "This is temporary. Once we are transferred to a permanent camp, conditions will change." Hans Krebs, an electrical specialist, disagreed. "The British follow rules. I've heard stories from men captured earlier. They get Red Cross parcels, medical treatment, proper camps." Dietrich listened without committing to either position. His experience as a mechanic had taught him to evaluate situations based on observable evidence rather than assumptions. The observable evidence suggested the British were following established protocols for prisoner treatment. Whether this would continue was uncertain. But for now, it was real. He noticed British soldiers moving through the enclosure, checking on prisoners who appeared injured or ill. A medical orderly stopped to examine a soldier's leg wound, applying fresh bandages from a first aid kit. The treatment was professional, efficient, neither kind nor cruel, simply competent. This wasn't the behavior of an army that planned to execute prisoners or allow them to die from neglect. Around the enclosure, other prisoners had similar conversations. Some remained suspicious, unable to accept this treatment as genuine. Others, particularly those who had been captured earlier in the campaign, confirmed that British POW camps operated according to international standards. The Red Cross visited regularly. Correspondence with families was permitted, though heavily censored. Work details were assigned, but conditions were tolerable. Dietrich considered his options. He had none, really. His fate was entirely in British hands, but knowing that established procedures existed provided some measure of comfort. He was no longer a soldier. He was a prisoner, subject to rules and regulations that existed outside the immediate chaos of combat. The sun had burned through the morning fog. The day was warming. Dietrich closed his eyes and let sunlight fall across his face. For the first time in months, he wasn't actively trying to kill anyone, and no one was actively trying to kill him. It was a strange feeling. He wasn't sure what to call it. Perhaps it was peace, temporary and fragile, but real nonetheless. At 12:00 p.m. on September 5th, 1944, a signal flare arced across the sky east of the prisoner enclosure. Red smoke trailed behind it, the Wehrmacht signal for enemy advance. British soldiers immediately shifted from relaxed posture to combat readiness. Rifles were unslung. Officers shouted orders. The casual atmosphere evaporated in seconds. Dietrich watched from behind the wire as British troops moved toward defensive positions. The transformation was remarkable. Men who had been distributing tea now prepared for combat with practiced efficiency. A platoon of Shermans that had been parked in a nearby field started their engines, the distinctive roar of right radial engines cutting through the afternoon air. Artillery batteries behind the British lines began firing, the heavy thump of 25-pounder guns shaking the ground. The incoming rounds whispered overhead, arcing toward German positions 2 kilometers east. This was the reality check. The war hadn't stopped. The tea and bread were real, but so was this. Enemy forces attempting a local counterattack. British forces responding with overwhelming firepower. Dietrich knew the mathematics. Wehrmacht units in this sector had lost most of their heavy equipment. Any counterattack would be infantry-based, probably a desperate attempt to buy time for other units to retreat. It would fail. It had to fail. The British had air superiority, artillery superiority, and numerical superiority. The only question was how many men would die before the attack collapsed. A guard approached the enclosure. "Everyone down on the ground," he ordered, gesturing to make his meaning clear. The prisoners complied immediately, lying flat in the mud. Standard procedure during combat: keep POWs visible and immobile to prevent escape attempts or friendly fire incidents. Dietrich pressed his face against cold earth and listened to the battle develop. Machine gun fire rattled in the distance, the distinct crack of Lee Enfield rifles answered by the slower, heavier sound of Mauser 98Ks. Artillery continued its overhead symphony. This was familiar territory for Dietrich, though his position had changed. He had spent months listening to battles from the German side, usually while working frantically to repair damaged vehicles under fire. Now he listened from the British side, a spectator rather than participant. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was safer as a prisoner than he had ever been as a soldier. By 0:10 p.m. on September 5th, 1944, the counterattack had intensified. British forward positions reported Wehrmacht infantry advancing in company strength. approximately 120 men attempting to penetrate Allied lines. The attack was poorly coordinated, lacking artillery support or armour. It had the character of a desperate gambit rather than a genuine tactical operation. Dietrich remained prone in the mud, listening to the progression of combat. The firing had grown closer, suggesting German forces had pushed forward against British defensive positions. But the volume of British fire hadn't decreased. If anything, it had intensified. Vickers' machine guns hammered away at cyclic rates, their distinctive sound punctuating the general chaos. Around him, German prisoners lay silent, each man lost in his own thoughts. Some prayed quietly, others simply waited, fatalistic acceptance of circumstances beyond their control. The guard who had ordered them down stood nearby, rifle ready but not aimed at the prisoners. His attention was directed toward the fighting, watching for threats from outside rather than inside the enclosure. The battle lasted 47 minutes, according to after-action reports compiled later that day. Wehrmacht forces achieved initial penetration of British forward positions, but were stopped by concentrated machine gun fire and artillery. When British Shermans moved forward to counterattack, German infantry broke and retreated. Casualties were approximately 70 German, dead or wounded, 12 British casualties, 3 fatal. The numbers would appear in official reports, sterile tallies, and that didn't capture the individual experience of men fighting and dying in Norman hedgerows. But for Dietrich, lying in the mud behind British wire, the numbers meant something specific. Those were men from Wehrmacht units, possibly men he had known, possibly mechanics or drivers or infantrymen he had shared rations with during the long retreat from Caen. They had attacked, knowing the attack would probably fail because orders demanded it or because desperation demanded it, and now they were dead or wounded or captured. Added to the growing total of German losses in Normandy, the firing slackened, then stopped entirely. British soldiers began moving again, some toward the fighting, others maintaining positions around the enclosure. The guard who had watched over the prisoners relaxed slightly, but remained alert. At 01:30 p.m. on September 5th, 1944, the first wounded soldiers arrived at the British field hospital established in the farmhouse complex. Dietrich watched from the enclosure as stretcher-bearers carried injured men toward medical tents. Some wounded were British, wearing battle dress and carrying Lee Enfields. Some were German, wearing field grey and carrying nothing at all. The medical personnel made no distinction. British and German wounded received treatment according to the severity of their injuries, not their nationality. A Wehrmacht corporal with a sucking chest wound was treated first, ahead of a British private with a leg injury. The British private showed no resentment. He sat on the ground, smoking a cigarette, waiting his turn. This was the application of medical triage, the practical ethics of battlefield medicine. Treat the worst injuries first, regardless of whose uniform the patient wore. Dietrich had never witnessed this before. On the Eastern Front, Wehrmacht medical units treated German casualties exclusively. Soviet wounded were left where they fell or shot if they were found. The same policy applied in reverse. The mutual brutality of the Eastern Front had been absolute. Here in Normandy, different rules applied. The Geneva Convention was more than words on paper. It was the British medic kneeling beside a German soldier, cutting away uniform fabric to access wounds, applying pressure bandages, administering morphine from British medical supplies. Thomas, the engineer Dietrich had spoken with earlier, appeared at the wire. "Your lads fought hard," he said without preamble. "Stupid to attack, but they fought hard." Dietrich nodded. There was nothing useful to say. The attack had been stupid. Everyone knew it, but soldiers followed orders, even stupid ones, because that was the fundamental contract of military service. You followed orders and you hoped the orders were good, And when they weren't good, you followed them anyway because the alternative was chaos. Some of them will make it, Thomas continued. The medical officer is good. Best in the battalion? Dietrich wanted to ask about specific men, about casualties, about which units had participated in the attack, but he had no way to ask these questions across the language barrier and the gulf of circumstance. He simply nodded. Again, the battle had produced 23 German prisoners, added to the existing 200 at 02 p.m. on September 5th, 1944. These new arrivals were different from the morning's group. They were freshly captured, still bleeding in some cases, still processing the shock of combat and capture. Guards brought them to the enclosure and provided the same treatment: tea, bread, medical attention for the wounded. But these men were harder, more suspicious. They had been fighting 30 minutes earlier. The transition from combat to captivity was too abrupt. One prisoner, a sergeant with a bandaged arm, refused the offered tea. He stared at the British soldiers with undisguised hatred. A corporal beside him accepted the cup, but didn't drink. They stood together, tense and watchful, expecting the kindness to transform into something else. Dietrich recognized the reaction. He had felt it himself that morning. The dissonance between expectation and reality created cognitive paralysis. You expected brutality. You received tea. The human mind struggled to reconcile the contradiction. Around the enclosure, longer-term prisoners tried to explain to the newcomers that the treatment was genuine, but explanations couldn't replace experience. Trust had to be earned through observation, through the accumulation of small confirmations that this situation was what it appeared to be. The afternoon wore on. More wounded arrived, both British and German. The medical staff worked without pause, moving between patients with practiced efficiency. At one point, a German doctor, captured during the morning's roundup, was permitted to assist with treatment of German wounded. He worked alongside British medical officers, trading minimal conversation but maximum professional cooperation. By 03 p.m., the immediate crisis had passed. The German counterattack had been repulsed. British casualties had been treated and evacuated. German prisoners had been processed and secured. The war continued, but this particular engagement had concluded. Dietrich sat near the fence watching the medical tents. A British soldier had died on the operating table, despite all efforts to save him. A German soldier, badly wounded in the chest, had survived thanks to prompt treatment. The randomness of it was absolute. Survival and death distributed according to no logic except chance, timing, and the competence of medical personnel who treated all wounded equally. At 02:30 p.m. on September 5th, 1944, something occurred that Dietrich would remember for the rest of his life. A British soldier named Private James Morrison, 19 years old, from Glasgow, had been shot through the abdomen during the counterattack. He lay on a stretcher near the medical tent, conscious but clearly dying. Morphine dulled the pain but couldn't change the prognosis. His intestines had been perforated in multiple locations. Without immediate surgical intervention, impossible in a field hospital, he had hours at most. A German prisoner, a medical orderly captured that morning, knelt beside Morrison's stretcher. His name was Klaus Weber, and he had served with Wehrmacht medical units since 1942. He had no medications to offer, no treatments that could change the outcome. But he stayed beside the stretcher, speaking quietly in broken English, offering what comfort he could provide. Morrison gripped Weber's hand. The British private's breathing was laboured, ragged. He spoke in Scots dialect that Weber couldn't understand, but the meaning transcended language. A dying man seeking human connection in his final moments. Weber held his hand and spoke softly in German, words that Morrison couldn't understand, but which carried the same meaning. You're not alone. A British chaplain arrived and knelt on Morrison's other side. He read from a small Bible, verses about peace and rest and valleys. The words were ancient, worn smooth by repetition across centuries, but they served their purpose. They provided structure to chaos, meaning to meaninglessness. Morrison died at 14:47 hours, according to the medical log. Cause of death: abdominal wounds, hemorrhagic shock. His body was carried away to be prepared for burial. Weber stood, wiping his hands on his trousers, and returned to the prisoner enclosure. No one spoke to him. No one thanked him. He had simply done what needed doing, providing comfort to a dying enemy because that was what his training and his conscience demanded. Dietrich had watched the entire scene from 30 meters away. He understood that he had witnessed something important, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. Perhaps it was the demonstration that humanity persisted even in circumstances designed to destroy it, that even in war, some choices remained. By 03 Aug p.m. on September 5, 1944, the prisoner enclosure had settled into a new equilibrium. 223 German soldiers sat behind wire, guarded by British troops who had just finished fighting. The morning's tentative trust had been tested by combat and had, improbably, survived. Tea was distributed again at 15:30 hours. This time, even the newly captured prisoners accepted it. They had watched the medical treatment. They had seen Weber helping Morrison. They had observed that the kindness extended in the morning hadn't been withdrawn after combat. The cognitive dissonance was resolving, replaced by cautious acceptance. Dietrich found himself in conversation with 3 other long-term prisoners, discussing what would happen next. Standard procedure would involve transfer to a permanent POW camp, probably in England. From there they would spend the remainder of the war as prisoners, subject to Geneva Convention protocols. Work details would be assigned. Conditions would be adequate if not comfortable. They would survive. "Better than Russia," Otto said quietly. Everyone nodded. The Eastern Front was a death sentence for prisoners on both sides. Capture meant torture, starvation, execution, or slow death in labor camps. The Western Front operated under different rules. Here, capture meant survival with some measure of dignity intact. It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't death. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the enclosure. British soldiers began preparing evening rations. The smell of cooking meat drifted through the camp. Army-issue stew, prepared in large pots over field stoves. Prisoners would receive the same rations as British troops, as required by regulations. Dietrich leaned against a fence post and closed his eyes. His war was over. He had survived Normandy, had survived capture, and would now survive as a prisoner. The outcome could have been much worse. He thought about the men who had attacked that afternoon, the 70 casualties listed in reports he would never see. They had fought because orders demanded it. Some had died. Some had been captured. The arbitrary nature of survival was absolute. Dietrich had been captured before the counterattack. That timing had saved his life. Nothing more complicated than that. Evening settled over the prisoner enclosure on September 5, 1944, as the sun descended toward the western horizon. Dietrich sat alone, his second day of captivity drawing to a close. The sky was clear, stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue. Artillery fire continued in the distance, a constant reminder that the war proceeded regardless of individual circumstances. He thought about Hamburg, about his family, about the machine shop where he had learned his trade before the war. He wondered if the shop still existed, or if Allied bombing had reduced it to rubble. He wondered if his family had survived. He had no way to know. Communication from POW camps was possible but slow, subject to censorship and the chaos of war. It might be months before he could send a letter home. But he would survive to send that letter. That was more than many could say. Around him other prisoners had similar thoughts, private contemplations of survival and loss, and the strange fortune that had placed them here rather than in a grave. The British guards moved through the camp, checking on prisoners, ensuring order. Their attitude had shifted from morning's cautious courtesy to something more routine. The prisoners were no longer a potential threat, just another administrative responsibility in the vast machinery of war. Thomas appeared at the fence one final time. "You'll be transferred tomorrow," he said. "Permanent camp in England. Better facilities, proper barracks." Dietrich nodded his understanding. Thomas extended his hand through the wire. Dietrich hesitated, then shook it. The gesture was simple, but it carried significance neither man could fully articulate. Across the divide of nationality and conflict, they had found common ground in the shared language of mechanics and the shared experience of men caught in circumstances beyond their control. As darkness fell, Dietrich lay on the Igi ground and stared at stars emerging overhead. The same stars had shone over Hamburg, over London, over all the battlefields of Europe. They were indifferent to human conflict, continuing their ancient patterns regardless of the chaos below. He closed his eyes and slept, dreamless and still. The war continued, but for one German mechanic from Hamburg, it had finally ended. Records compiled after the war showed that 98.7% of German prisoners held in British custody survived their captivity, the highest survival rate of any belligerent power. The morning tea distribution at prisoner enclosures throughout Normandy became standard procedure, mentioned in multiple unit reports as an effective method for maintaining order and encouraging surrender. The practice cost the British Army approximately £200 of tea weekly in August-September 1944, supplied from standard rations, and required no additional logistical burden beyond what was already allocated for troop support. Private James Morrison, Glasgow, died September 5, 1944, from abdominal wounds sustained in action. He was 19 years old. His name appears on the Bio-War Cemetery Memorial, among 4,648 Commonwealth servicemen buried there. Klaus Weber, Wehrmacht medical orderly, survived the war as a POW in England. He returned to Germany in 1947 and worked as a hospital orderly in Munich until his retirement in 1982. Dietrich Braun was transferred to a permanent POW camp near Liverpool on September 7, 1944. He returned to Hamburg in 1946, finding his family alive and his former shop partially destroyed, but rebuildable. He worked as a mechanic until 1978. In interviews conducted in the 1990s, he consistently mentioned the morning of September 5, 1944, describing it as, quote, "the day I understood that not all enemies were the same." The file closed without additional comment. The numbers had already told their story. In a war characterized by industrial-scale brutality, small acts of decency had persisted in unexpected places, maintained by men who chose to uphold standards even when circumstances might have excused their abandonment. The tea had been real, the bread had been real, the treatment had been real. These facts were documented in unit reports, prisoner logs, and decades of testimony. They existed as evidence that even in the machinery of total war, human choices still mattered, that perhaps the greatest victory wasn't defeating the enemy, but remaining human while doing so.